Welcome to Brian Maddox Teaches Yamaha QL and CL Consoles in partnership with the Production Academy. I'm your host, Brian Maddox. I'm your teacher, Brian. I'm the only one here, is Brian Maddox. I'm the one that's doing the stuff. We're going to talk about Yamaha CL and QL consoles. Today we're going to launch the conversation with just a discussion of Yamaha QL and CL consoles, the basic line, what differentiates them, what doesn't differentiate them, what they have in common. So, to begin with, what's the difference between the Yamaha CL and QL console series? So there are two QL consoles in the Yamaha line. There's the QL1 and the QL5. And there are three CL consoles in the Yamaha console line, the CL1, CL3, and CL5. Not surprisingly, bigger numbers mean bigger consoles with more stuff. At its most simple level, the difference between the CL and the QL lines are the number of mix buses that you have, so the number of outputs that you can create. The QL series has 16 mix buses and 8 matrices. The CL series has 24 mix buses and 8 matrices. So that's probably the biggest fundamental difference between the two lines. The other fundamental difference is the basic layout of the faders. So I've got a CL3 here, and one of the things you can see is that I've got multiple fader banks. Let me just move something so we can see what's going on. So I've got this fader bank, and it operates independently from this center fader bank and operates independently from the masters. So that's sort of a fundamental control difference between the QL and the CL, because the QL series only has basically one fader layer, one primary layer. The CL series has multiples. Now, depending on the depending on exactly the model that you're using, will then dictate just how many faders you have. So the QL and the CL both have, the QL has 16 faders and 2 masters. The QL5 has 32 faders and 2 masters. And then the CL series, this is the CL3, which is the middle range. The CL1 drops this first bank, so it has this bank and then the central logic bank. The CL3 adds this bank of faders. The CL5 adds a bank of faders over here. Picture where my hand is, another bank of faders. And that right side bank of faders operates it's a different fader layer with different fader layer buttons, and it can be run in something completely independently. Now, so then the other fundamental difference between all 5 of these mixing consoles is the amount of channels that they have available to mix, as well as the amount of physical inputs and physical outputs. As a quick little aside, one of the first things that you have to get used to when you transition from an analog mixing console world to a digital mixing console world is that channels and inputs, mix buses or auxes or groups, and outputs no longer directly correlate with each other. You can have a mixing console that has 256 inputs, but only 32 channels. So you only have access to 32 of those inputs at any given time. The same thing could be true of the outputs. In Yamaha speak, they talk about inputs as imports. You don't see that word very often, but that's what they refer to them, and outputs as outports. So the big difference between the QL series and the CL series is one of the big differences is the number of physical inputs and outputs that are on the consoles. The QL, ironically, since it is the lower cost alternative, has more analog inputs and outputs. So a QL1 has 16 analog mic pre-inputs and 8 analog outputs. The QL5 has 32 analog inputs, 16 analog outputs. So those are desks that are kind of primarily designed I think originally when they were thinking it, one, they were copying the LS9 line a little bit, and two, this was a drop-in for existing analog situations where you already had analog snakes in place, and it was just a very, I'll drop this in, plug my analog stuff into it, and away I go. The CL series is kind of the next step up, where they're assuming you're going all in on a digital snake scenario. And so the surfaces only have 8 analog inputs and 8 analog outputs. And then it's assumed that all of the other physical inputs and outputs are either going to come via the Dante port or through the various card slots. So that's a fundamental difference. So one of the things that's interesting is that even though this is more console than a QL5, it certainly has more control surface than a QL1. It actually has less physical analog inputs and outputs in it. It only has 8 each way. So if I need to get more than 8 inputs in or more than 8 outputs out of it, I need to either use Dante port or use card slots. Which leads me to card slots, which is another fundamental difference between the lines. The QL1 has 1 card slot. The QL5 has 2 card slots. The entire CL series has 3 card slots, I think is true. I know the CL3 and the CL5 do. I think the CL1 also has 3 card slots. And these are Yamaha MY card slots. Yamaha then makes, and other people make, a plethora of things that can be put into these card slots that will interface with almost every kind of digital snake system, SDI embedders, de-embedders, Dante cards, Ethersound cards, Waves card. If you want to integrate directly with a Waves system, you can put a Waves card in. Google Yamaha MY cards, and there's a pile of them. Each card slot is 16 outputs and 16 inputs. So that's the physical limitation of the card slot. So no matter what you put in it, you can't get more than 16 outs and 16 ins in that one card slot. But that's the other expansion mode for the CL series. I think this is the last thing I can think of off the top of my head that differentiates the consoles, and that is channel count. So we talked about imports and outputs, or physical inputs, physical outputs. This is actual mixing channels. We talked about the mix bus difference, which is basically the QLs have 8 less mix buses, but are otherwise identical. On the input side, however, the QL1 has, let me back up for just a second. All of the consoles have the same number of stereo inputs, which is 8. So all of the consoles have 8 stereo inputs. Mono inputs vary wildly, however. The QL1 has the QL1 has 32. The QL5 has 64, which is amazing for the price point and the size of it. The CL1 has 48, and the CL3 has 64, and the CL5 has 72. So each one of those is just a little bit different, but interestingly enough, the QL5 has the same number of inputs as the console that I have here, the CL3. The same number of channels, has the same number of channels. It's actually kind of an amazing machine in that it's not very high cost and really can mix a tremendous amount of inputs and outputs. So what are general costs? That's a great question, Scott. I'm going to give rough numbers. I know some of us aren't even from the US, and US dollars won't even really matter. But strictly from a scale standpoint, to give you a rough idea, these prices probably, if you looked them up right now, have changed because these consoles aren't currently available. And so that's really made things interesting in the open market. But in rough numbers, and as soon as I say this, someone's going to pipe in and go, that's not what I saw it for. But just to give you a framework, a QL1 is about $8,000. A QL5 is about $14,000. A CL1 is about $21,000. A CL3 is about $25,000 to $26,000, and a CL5 is pushing $30,000. So that just gives you, those numbers may be off $2,000 or $1,000 in either direction, but you at least can kind of see how that scales up. So the QL1 is, about about the fourth of the price of a CL5. So the line just sort of goes up along those lines.